This is the story of USS West Virginia, a battleship that was sunk at Pearl Harbor, raised from the mud, rebuilt for revenge, and then destroyed a Japanese battleship in the last battleship-versus-battleship engagement in naval history. Within 15 years of that victory, she and every other American battleship that fought that night had been scrapped or sunk as atomic bomb targets, and no museum ship was preserved, no major memorial was built. They simply vanished. To understand why this battle mattered so much, we need to go back to December 7, 1941, when USS West Virginia sat moored at Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning as one of America's most powerful warships. A Colorado-class battleship measuring 624 feet long and displacing nearly 35,000 tons, she carried 8 16-inch guns that could hurl 1-ton shells over 20 miles. 7 torpedoes slammed into her port side when the Japanese attacked at 7:55 a.m. that morning. Most battleships would sink after 2 or 3 torpedo hits, but West Virginia took 7, and the ship immediately began listing to port so severely that she would have capsized and turned turtle, trapping her entire crew underwater in the harbor mud. Lieutenant Commander J.S. Harper, the ship's damage control officer, made a split-second decision that saved hundreds of lives when he ordered the intentional flooding of compartments on the starboard side, the opposite side from the torpedo hits, and this counter-flooding kept the ship upright as she settled into the harbor mud. She sank level rather than rolling over, which meant the difference between hundreds dead and hundreds saved. Even so, 106 men aboard West Virginia died that day, and some were killed instantly by the explosions, while others were trapped in compartments below the waterline as the ship went down. When salvage crews finally raised West Virginia months later, they found a calendar in one sealed compartment where 3 sailors had survived the sinking and remained alive in that pitch-black, airless space, and they marked off 16 days before they died. West Virginia sat on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, with her superstructure protruding above the water like a gravestone, officially written off as a total loss, and the Navy expected her to be scrapped where she lay. But that's when something changed, because America needed every warship it could get, and someone looked at West Virginia and saw not a wreck, but an opportunity for vengeance. May 1942 brought the raising of West Virginia from the harbor floor in a salvage operation that alone qualified as an engineering marvel, but raising her was just the beginning, since she needed to be completely rebuilt. They towed her to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington State, and what happened there over the next 2 years went far beyond simple repair work. The Navy transformed her into one of the most technologically advanced battleships in the world. Her superstructure was entirely removed and rebuilt from scratch. Her beam increased from 97 feet to 108 feet to improve stability, and she received modern anti-aircraft guns including 40 40mm Bofors and 58 20mm Oerlikon cannons, while her crew capacity swelled to over 2,300 men. But here's what mattered most. She was fitted with the Mark 8 fire control radar, and this is the detail that would decide everything at Surigao Strait. This radar system could track targets and direct gunfire in total darkness at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, over 11 miles into the night, and it used centimetric radar with short wavelengths that provided exceptional accuracy. In 1944, this technology gave American battleships an overwhelming advantage over any opponent who lacked it, which meant the Japanese were about to face an enemy who could see them when they couldn't see anything at all. By July 1944, West Virginia was ready to return to the Pacific. But here's something that makes this story even more remarkable. Captain Herbert Wiley commanded a ship where the majority of officers and men had never been to sea before, and only 12 enlisted men had previous sea experience. This crew had 3 months to transform from landlubbers into battle-ready veterans, and they were sailing toward the Philippines, sailing toward revenge. October 1944 arrived with General Douglas MacArthur fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines as the liberation of the islands was underway, and Leyte Gulf became the target. If America could secure Leyte, they would cut Japan's access to oil from the Dutch East Indies, which meant Japan would lose the war, and the Japanese Navy knew it. They devised a desperate, complex plan called Operation Shogo, where 4 separate Japanese naval forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, trap the American invasion fleet, and destroy it. The largest force under Admiral Takeo Kurita would approach from the north through San Bernardino Strait. A carrier force under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would act as bait to lure away the American carrier fleet, and Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would lead the southern force through Surigao Strait from the south. Nishimura's force included 2 battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, both Fuso-class battleships built back in 1917 that had been modernized over the years but remained old ships measuring 665 feet long, displacing over 39,000 tons, and armed with 12 14-inch guns arranged in 6 twin turrets. They were distinctive because of their massive pagoda-style superstructures that towered above the deck like ancient temples made of steel. More significant for what was about to happen, they had radar. But Japanese radar in 1944 was primitive and largely ineffective, couldn't provide the accuracy needed to direct gunfire, which meant Japanese ships would have to rely on visual sighting and range finding even at night. Nishimura's mission was essentially suicidal, and he probably knew it. Ordered to charge through Surigao Strait, a narrow body of water between islands, and attack the American landing forces. To reach his target, he would have to run a gauntlet where first PT boats would harass him, then American destroyers would launch torpedo attacks, and finally, if anything survived, he would face a battle line of American battleships waiting at the northern end of the strait. West Virginia was waiting there, along with 5 other American battleships, including Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, and 4 of those 6 had been at Pearl Harbor, where 3 had been sunk or damaged that day. Now they were about to face Japanese battleships in the kind of surface engagement the Navy had trained for, but which many thought would never happen in the carrier age. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the American force from his flagship, the cruiser Louisville, and he'd positioned his ships in a classic battle line formation across the northern exit of Surigao Strait. This meant that when the Japanese ships emerged from the narrow strait, they would be approaching in single file, unable to bring all their guns to bear, while the American ships would be crossing their path perpendicular to their line of advance with every gun able to fire. Naval tacticians call this crossing the T, and it's the holy grail of naval tactics dating back to the age of sail, because it means you can fire full broadsides while your enemy can only shoot with forward-facing guns. The last time this maneuver had been successfully executed came at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese Navy crossed the T against the Russian Baltic Fleet. Now, 39 years later, American ships would cross the T against Japanese battleships, and it would also be the last time in human history. The date was October 24th, turning into October 25th, 1944, and it was after 10 p.m. when PT boats first made radar contact with Nishimura's force off Bohol Island. The small patrol torpedo boats tried to attack, but scored no hits, yet what they accomplished was alerting Oldendorf that the Japanese were coming and forcing Nishimura to make evasive maneuvers. Nishimura kept coming because he had his orders and he would break through or die trying. At 2:59 a.m., the American destroyer screen launched their attack as 39 destroyers in 3 groups swept down the flanks of Surigao Strait, firing torpedoes and then retiring before the Japanese could respond, and the results came devastating. Torpedoes from USS Melvin struck the battleship Fuso amidships at 3:09 a.m. as massive explosions tore through her hull, and she fell out of formation, mortally wounded, burning and dead in the water. At 3:20 a.m., the Japanese destroyer Yamagumo exploded and sank with all hands, while the destroyer Michishio was crippled, and the destroyer Asagumo had her bow blown completely off but somehow remained afloat. The battleship Yamashiro, Nishimura's flagship, was hit by a torpedo from USS Monson at 3:21 a.m., striking her port quarter, and her speed dropped temporarily to 10 knots before another torpedo from USS Killen hit her port bow at 3:31 a.m., and her communications were severely damaged. But Nishimura kept coming, recovered speed, got Yamashiro back up to 18 knots, and continued his advance toward the American battle line, and he had to know by now that this was hopeless, with his force shredded, and Fuso sinking behind him while he steamed into the darkness toward an enemy he couldn't see, an enemy who could see him perfectly. American cruisers opened fire at 3:51 a.m. as 8 cruisers, including Louisville, Portland, Minneapolis, Denver, Columbia, Phoenix, Boise, and HMS Shropshire, began pumping out 6-inch and 8-inch armor-piercing shells at a range of 15,800 yards, with USS Denver firing first. And that's when, at exactly 3:52 a.m. and 10 seconds, USS West Virginia opened fire. 22,800 yards separated the ships, nearly 13 miles in total darkness, and the target was invisible to the naked eye. West Virginia's gunnery officer watched his radar screen, fired the first salvo with all 8 16-inch guns, sending shells that weighed 2,100 pounds, each flying through the night. And approximately 30 seconds later, they struck while the gunnery officer chuckled and announced, "Hit first salvo." Think about what that means, firing shells in pitch blackness at a range of 13 miles that took half a minute to reach their target, and West Virginia achieved hits on the opening salvo because that's what Mark 8 radar could do. Yamashiro was burning as the shells struck around her massive pagoda superstructure, starting fires that silhouetted her for the other American ships. Tennessee and California joined the engagement at 3:55 a.m., and more 14-inch shells rained down on Yamashiro as she burned heavily now, with flames visible from her pagoda mast through her entire superstructure. At 3:56 a.m., Yamashiro turned to port, trying to unmask more of her guns and return fire, and she was firing back, but blindly, aiming at the muzzle flashes of American guns while Japanese shells were landing near the American formation. But Japanese gunnery remained crude and ineffective because they couldn't see what they were shooting at. Maryland opened fire at 3:59 a.m. without the advanced radar, ranging by watching where west. Virginia's shells were splashing and adjusting from there. At 4:00 a.m., Yamashiro's No. 4 turret was destroyed, and fires were raging from her No. 3 turret all the way to her mainmast, a floating inferno. West Virginia ceased fire at 4:02 a.m. after firing 93 rounds of 16-inch ammunition in 10 minutes, down to only 110 armor-piercing shells remaining and needing to conserve ammunition in case another target appeared. Those 10 minutes represented how long West Virginia fired, and in those 10 minutes she'd helped deliver mortal wounds to Yamashiro. But the Japanese battleship wasn't done yet, and at 4:05 a.m., a third torpedo from USS Benion struck Yamashiro's starboard side while she was taking water, listing, burning, and still advancing. At 4:07 a.m., something unfortunate happened when USS Albert W. Grant, an American destroyer that had pressed too close during the torpedo attacks, found herself caught in the crossfire and was hit 19 times, including 11 shells from American ships and 7 from Japanese ships in a friendly fire incident that killed or wounded 94 men, though she survived. USS Mississippi fired the final salvo in the engagement at 4:08 a.m., 12 14-inch rounds at 19,790 yards, and this would be recorded as the last battleship salvo in history, the final time one battleship's main guns would ever fire at another battleship in combat. Admiral Oldendorf ordered ceasefire at 4:09 a.m., and the American ships went silent. And here's where you see something about the Japanese warrior spirit, because Yamashiro was dying, shot to pieces, burning, flooding, surrounded by enemies who had just demonstrated they could destroy her at will, and she could have surrendered or turned back or simply drifted. Instead, at 4:09 a.m., as the American guns went quiet, Yamashiro turned south and increased speed to 16 knots, defiant to the end, trying to escape, which was futile. 2 more torpedoes struck Yamashiro's starboard side at 4:11 a.m. and 50 seconds, hitting her engine room, and her list increased to 45 degrees to port as she was capsizing. The order to abandon ship was given at 4:14 a.m., while Vice Admiral Nishimura and Rear Admiral Shinoda remained on the bridge, going down with their ship and following the samurai code. At 4:19 a.m., USS Yamashiro capsized stern first and sank with what witnesses described as deadly suddenness as radar operators on USS Tennessee watched their screen where the target shrank and then simply vanished. Of Yamashiro's crew of 1,636 men, only 10 survived, while Fuso, the other battleship, sank separately after being fatally wounded earlier by destroyer torpedoes and went down around 3:45 a.m. with only 10 survivors from her crew of 1,630. In total, the Japanese lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers in Surigao Strait as approximately 4,000 Japanese sailors died. American losses came to 39 killed, 114 wounded, and 1 PT boat, which wasn't a battle, but an execution. When the sun rose on October 25th, the water of Surigao Strait was choked with debris and survivors as Japanese sailors clung to wreckage, swimming toward shore, and many who reached land were killed by Filipino guerrillas seeking revenge for 3 years of brutal occupation. The same morning, about 80 miles north, the battle off Samar was raging where escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy III were making their famous last stand against Admiral Kurita's battleship force, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, and that David versus Goliath battle would capture the public imagination and overshadow what happened at Surigao Strait. But the men aboard USS West Virginia knew what they'd done, and Roy Romano, a gunner's mate second class, said it simply when he stated, "We got even for Pearl Harbor. We got even." Captain Herbert Wiley wrote in his action report that enough cannot be said regarding the sterling performance of officers and men, since only a short 3 months ago the ship left the Navy Yard, and the greater percentage of officers and men had never been to sea before, with only 12 enlisted men having previous sea experience, and they lifted themselves by their bootstraps to be competent and battle-tried veterans. A crew of novices, most of whom had never been to sea, operated one of the most complex weapon systems in the world in the dark under combat conditions and achieved devastating accuracy, which speaks to American training, American technology, and American determination. The Battle of Leyte Gulf continued for another day, but the outcome was decided as Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, and the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force while Japan's oil lifeline was cut. The war in the Pacific would continue for another 10 months, but Japan had no path to victory, and West Virginia continued fighting as she bombarded Japanese positions at Mindoro and Luzon before joining the invasion fleet at Iwo Jima and later at Okinawa. On August 12, 1945, 3 days before Japan surrendered, she shot down 2 kamikaze aircraft attacking the fleet. September 2, 1945, found USS West Virginia present in Tokyo Bay when Japan formally surrendered aboard USS Missouri, and she'd sailed from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, from the war's beginning to its end, from destruction to vengeance to victory. And that's when America forgot about her. Here's where this story takes its strange turn, because the 6 American battleships that fought at Surigao Strait, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania represented the culmination of battleship development and proved their worth in the last battleship engagement in history as symbols of American naval power and American revenge for Pearl Harbor. Within 15 years, all 6 were gone, scrapped or sunk as targets, and not one was preserved as a museum ship. January 1947 brought the decommissioning of USS West Virginia, and she sat in the reserve fleet for 12 years until August 1959, when she was sold for scrap, cut apart, and melted down, and her bell ended up at the West Virginia State Museum in Charleston, while her mast was installed at West Virginia University, and an anti-aircraft gun sits in a city park in Parkersburg, which is all that remains. USS Maryland was decommissioned in April 1947 and scrapped in 1959. USS Tennessee was decommissioned in February 1947 and scrapped in 1959. USS California was decommissioned in 1946 and scrapped in 1959. USS Pennsylvania was damaged by the last Japanese aerial torpedo of the war on August 12, 1945, and she was used as a target in the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in July 1946 during Operation Crossroads. And the atomic blast didn't sink her, but she was so contaminated with radiation that she couldn't be salvaged, so she was towed out to sea and scuttled on February 10, 1948. USS Mississippi had the longest life after being converted to a weapons test ship in 1947, redesignated AG-128, and she tested the first shipborne surface-to-air missile, the Terrier, in 1953 before being finally scrapped in November 1956. By 1959, every American battleship that fought at Surigao Strait had ceased to exist. Several reasons explain why this happened, starting with the fact that these were World War I-era designs since West Virginia, and her sisters were built in the 1920s based on designs from 1916, and by 1945 they were considered obsolete because they were slow at only 21 knots, while aircraft carriers could make 33 knots. And in the carrier age, speed mattered. Second, they were expensive to maintain, since battleships required enormous crews of over 2,000 men each and massive amounts of fuel oil, making them budget killers in peacetime. Third, America in 1945 wanted to forget the war and move forward with a mood that was forward-looking, optimistic, technological, and these battleships represented the old way of warfare, while the future belonged to carriers, submarines, and eventually nuclear power. Fourth, museum ship preservation wasn't common in the 1940s and 1950s, as the concept barely existed, and even USS Enterprise, the most decorated ship of World War II and the carrier that fought at Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, was scrapped in 1958 despite a passionate campaign to save her. And if Enterprise couldn't be preserved, what chance did the battleships have? But there's something deeper going on here, because the Battle of Surigao Strait was overshadowed by the Battle off Samar, where Taffy III's desperate fight against overwhelming odds became the legendary story of Leyte Gulf, since destroyers charging battleships, escort carriers fleeing at flank speed, and heroic last stands make up the narrative that captured imaginations. Surigao Strait was too one-sided, too technical, too much about radar and gunnery solutions and crossing the T, and it was a crushing American victory, which meant it wasn't dramatic, because there was no underdog and no impossible odds overcome, just American technological superiority executing Japanese ships with methodical precision. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official historian of U.S. naval operations in World War II, wrote something worth hearing in full when he stated that when Mississippi discharged her 12 14-inch guns at Yamashiro, she was not only giving that battleship the coup de grace, but firing a funeral salvo to a finished era of naval warfare, and one can imagine the ghosts of all great admirals from Raleigh to Jellicoe standing at attention as the battle line went into oblivion along with the Greek phalanx, the Spanish wall of pikemen, the English longbow, and the row galley tactics of Salamis and Lepanto. That's what Surigao Strait represented, the end of a 500-year tradition of ships of the line battering each other with cannon, and from the age of sail through Trafalgar, from the ironclads of the Civil War through Jutland, naval warfare had been about getting your battle line into position and hammering the enemy with broadsides. October 25, 1944 was the last time human beings would ever do that, and battleships would continue to serve since the Iowa-class battleships were modernized and saw action in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War, but they never again fought another battleship as their role became shore bombardment and missile platforms. The era was over, and we scrapped the evidence, and today if you want to visit a World War II battleship, you have options including USS Alabama in Mobile, USS North Carolina in Wilmington, USS Massachusetts in Fall River, USS Iowa in Los Angeles, USS New Jersey in Camden, USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor, and USS Wisconsin in Norfolk. But none of those ships fought at Surigao Strait. None were at the last battleship engagement in history, and none except Missouri were present at the Japanese surrender. The ships that were there, the ships that crossed the T, that avenged Pearl Harbor, that closed the book on 5 centuries of naval warfare, they're gone and cut apart and sold for scrap metal. In 2017 and 2019, the wreck of Yamashiro was located by Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel at approximately 200 meters depth in the Surigao Strait, found inverted or upside down on the seafloor, and the wreck is treated as a war grave with the exact position not publicly disclosed. Fuso was also located, contrary to decades of historical accounts claiming she'd broken in half on the surface, and she's intact though also inverted at about 160 meters depth. Both Japanese battleships still exist deep underwater as eternal monuments to that night, but West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, and California exist only in photographs, in documents, in the memories of the few remaining veterans, and in scattered artifacts like bells and anchors and gun barrels installed in parks. In Surigao City, Philippines, there's a memorial shrine that opened in 2019 for the 75th anniversary of the battle, and it features a Japanese Type 93 torpedo, uniforms, and photographs, which is more than exists in America for this battle. There is no USS West Virginia Memorial, no dedicated museum, no place where Americans can go to stand on the deck where that radar-directed fire control system obliterated a Japanese battleship at 13 miles in total darkness. The ships vanished, and with them, the memory of what they accomplished. USS West Virginia was sunk at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, then raised, rebuilt, and modernized into one of the most technologically advanced battleships in the world before firing the opening salvos on October 25, 1944, in the last battleship-versus-battleship engagement in history with a crew of mostly inexperienced sailors. She achieved hits with her first salvo at a range of 13 miles in total darkness and helped destroy the Japanese battleship Yamashiro in approximately 26 minutes from first hit to capsizing. She was present at the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, and then she was forgotten, decommissioned in 1947, scrapped in 1959, and erased from existence. All 6 American battleships that fought at Surigao Strait met the same fate as not one was preserved, and the last battleship battle in human history has no museum ship to commemorate it. There's an irony here that's almost poetic, because these ships represented the pinnacle of a form of warfare that had dominated naval thinking for 5 centuries, proved their worth in one final dramatic decisive action, and immediately afterward were judged obsolete and discarded. They vanished because they represented a past that America was eager to move beyond, since the future belonged to carriers, jets, missiles, and eventually nuclear weapons. And there was no room for nostalgia about gun-armed behemoths from the age of Pearl Harbor. But in vanishing, they took something with them, took the physical connection to that moment when American battleships raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor crossed the T against Japanese battleships in a classic naval engagement. And they took the tangible reminder that revenge, when it came, was delivered with precision, with overwhelming technological superiority, and with methodical ruthlessness. The Battle of Surigao Strait was the exclamation point at the end of the battleship age, and we erased it. What remains are photographs in archives, action reports and naval records, and the testimony of the few veterans still alive who served aboard those ships, along with 2 Japanese battleships lying inverted on the floor of Surigao Strait as war graves that will rest there until the metal corrodes away. The battleship that sank a Japanese giant didn't vanish in 13 minutes, but she did vanish slowly, deliberately, completely, within 15 years of her greatest triumph, and she took the memory of that triumph with her. That's the story of USS West Virginia and the Battle of Surigao Strait, the last battleship duel, the forgotten victory, and the ships that vanished from history. Retry Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.